verses 5 through 8 is first of all in their possessions, as it relates to their possessions. The main ambition for the Babylonians was not for God, but rather for gold. Their hearts were filled and flooded and fashioned by the overwhelming desire for more. Bluntly, listen to what it says. Note well, money deceives. The arrogant rich don't last. They're hungry. They're more hungry for wealth than the graves are for cadavers. Like death, they always want more. And the more they get is dead bodies. Their cemeteries filled with dead nations, graveyards filled with corpses. Don't give people like this a second thought. Soon the whole world will be taunting them. God says to the people of Babylon that their hunger, their thirst for more will ultimately be their own demise. The truth of the matter is their hunger and thirst for more is compared to the graveyards. That the graveyards never get filled up, because as long as there's life upon this earth, the Scripture says, for it is appointed unto man once to die. Every man that's walked the face of the earth will come to the point of death. Graveyards never cease to long for more in that particular idea. The truth of the matter is, it's that kind of longing that Habakkuk, or God equates before Habakkuk, to the greed and hunger and thirst for more of the Babylonian people. However, the Scripture says, God says, He warns them, because you have plundered many nations, the peoples who are left will ultimately plunder you. In other words, God promises that the victors will one day become the victims. Of course, this is what happened. If you were to read over in the Bibles in Daniel chapter 5, what you'll find in Daniel chapter 5, that it was the greed and the arrogance of Babylon that left them vulnerable before the nations. There was a nation called the Medes and Persians that came in and invaded Babylon and overthrew Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5. That Babylon had plundered, because they had plundered many nations, and as a result, she herself, from the hands of the Medes and Persians, were plundered. She had shed many rivers of blood, the Scripture says, and yet in that day the Medes and Persians shed the blood of the Babylonian people. Simply put, she reaped what she had sown. They had an intolerable greed for possessions. But the Scripture also says, verses 9 through 11, that they had an intolerable greed for position as well. Number 2, position. Notice what the New Living Translation translates this. He says, what sorrow awaits you who build big houses with money gained dishonestly. You believe your wealth will buy security, putting your family's nest beyond the reach of danger. Now notice the analogy. By the murders you commit, you have shamed your name and forfeited your lives. The very stones and the walls that you have built by the anguish of others will cry out against you, and the beams and the ceilings will echo the complaints. The Babylonians broke one of the 10 commandments because they stole possessions in order to steal position. In other words, they took what did not belong to them in order to set up a kingdom that did not belong to them either. Their goal was a goal of security. Habakkuk's there in verse 9, the contemporary English version said in verse 9, you made your family rich at the expense of others. You even said to yourself, I am above the law. In other words, the only concern they had was building an empire that would glorify themselves and assure safety, like one translation said, like an eagle's nest that's been placed high upon a mountain, far out of reach from anyone else. However, God says that the consequences of their desire, their intolerable greed for position would be, verse 11, that the stones will ultimately cry out, the beams of the woodwork will echo that cry. In other words, instead of having houses that would bring honor, they had houses that ultimately is going to bring disgrace and shame on the position that they thought they had. They had an intolerable greed for possessions and position. But number 3, in verses 12 and 13, they also had an intolerable greed for power. Verse 12, woe, woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by crying. Has not the Lord determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire? The bloodshed that's spoken of here speaks of a multitude of bloodshed. Some translations or some commentators have talked about the bloodshed as being like rivers from the places that the Babylonians had gone into to conquer. The word established in the passage literally means to set up or to make sure or to make firm a foundation. In other words, the Babylonians had established or set up or built their empire upon the blood of others. The bloodshed was the blood of innocent victims. Their empire was built by prisoners of war and slavery that had been exploited to the fullest extent. But God said, verse 13, Message paraphrase, the last phrase in verse 13, the Message paraphrase says this: make sure the harder you work at the kind of thing, the less you are. So I read this, I thought about, who are we talking about here? What nation? Babylon. Babylon. Babylon is now reaping the prophetic curse, as it were, for the prophetic word of destruction from God. God's speaking toward them that there's coming a time when they're going to be destroyed. And obviously Daniel 5 says there's a time when the Medes and Persians are going to come in, and ultimately we saw that happening, and history records for that. But I believe the picture is far broader. The paint stroke that God intends for Habakkuk's day is far broader than that paint stroke. Because if I look into Scripture and I look at how the scriptural context uses Babylon, Babylon is also referred to as we think about the time that's yet to come. Revelation chapter 17 and chapter 17 and chapter 18. You might want to write that down, go back and study that later. But it talks about how that the great harlot will come and establish a kingdom unto himself. And the great harlot is identified in that particular passage as whom? Babylon. And it would be just before the last days that Babylon, in that day, the great harlot will be destroyed. Ultimately destroyed. So I walk away from that and I say, why is it that God has laid such a terrible assessment upon a people? God's going to use Babylon to fix His own people, judge His own people, bring judgment against Babylon, ultimately bring judgment against Babylon again as we see the coming days. But why Babylon? You know, it seems like God's chosen people in Scripture, and we know that is Israel. And they're always underneath God's protective hand. Even to this day, when they're no longer the recipients of grace because of their hardness of hearts they would never receive. And yet the Scripture says, Romans 9 and 10 and 11 says that God has preserved for Him a remnant of people from His own people, because they're still His people. But scripturally, there's also a people that seems to be the people of curse.